Welcome back to the live webinar here at BINA. Apologies for not having it for the past week. I was away in New York, which perhaps we may discuss as we go along here. So we find ourselves reading these weeks the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis, which is filled with what one might call the most bizarre stories, one after another. Jacob stealing the blessings from Esau, from Yitzchak, and many other stories like that. Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, many other bizarre episodes which are very difficult to understand. But this week we have one which is also very difficult to understand, and perhaps if we look into it a little more deeper to the spiritual side, it might make more sense. Let's briefly go through the story. I'm sure many of you know it. And then we'll try to take it apart and learn a very important lesson for the Jewish people and what it means to fulfill the Jewish mission upon this earth. So the story goes that Yaakov Avinu, after having stolen the blessings from his brother Esau, runs away from Esau, fearing Esau's wrath, that Esau is going to kill him, and he runs away to the land of Haran, to the city of Haran, with two intentions. First of all, to run away from Esau, but also to find a wife from his family, which is what the forefathers did. They married into the family. He comes there, and he comes to the well, and he sees his cousin, Rochel, standing by the well. And Rochel was an incredibly beautiful girl. That's the way the Torah describes her. There were two sisters, Leah and Rochel. Leah, it says, her eyes were red from crying. Rochel had a beautiful appearance. And right away, Yaakov decides he wants to marry Rochel. But the initial meeting between Yaakov and Rochel is very intense. It says that Yaakov starts to cry when he meets Rochel. And then he goes to his future father-in-law, Lavan, and asks for Rochel's hand in marriage. And Lavan agrees. He says, work for me for 7 years, and I will give you my daughter. He does that. Comes the night of the wedding, and the way the Torah describes this, Lavan gives Leah, the older sister, to Yaakov instead of Rochel. Yaakov wakes up in the morning, and behold, it is a Leah. He comes to his father-in-law and says, why did you trick me? And Lavan says, the custom in our place is not to give the younger sister before the older sister. Marry Rochel at the end of 7 days, and you'll work another 7 years for her. What exactly is going on over here? This doesn't sound like a very normal story. He wanted to marry Rochel, he ended up marrying Leah, then he married Rochel also. When he met Rochel, why did he start crying? What was going on over there? So before we get into the deeper spiritual side of the story, just a couple of points that the commentaries say on this. First of all, and this will be relevant to understand later, why did Yaakov cry when he met Rochel? So it says that there were two reasons. One reason is that he came with absolutely nothing. He came with nothing, no money, no jewelry, no possessions. He came as a pauper with absolutely nothing. Why? He came from a very rich family, Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak, they had a lot of money. Because when he was running away from Esau, one of Esau's sons chased him. And his name was Eliphaz. And Eliphaz had the command from his father to kill Yaakov. However, he didn't really want to kill Yaakov because he didn't want to kill. So he was in a predicament. He didn't want to kill Yaakov, but on the other hand, he had a command from his father. What was he supposed to do? So Yaakov tells him, I have a solution. Rob me, make sure I have absolutely no possession left in my name. And the Talmud tells us that somebody who has absolutely nothing, chashuv kameis, is considered as if they are dead. And therefore, it'll be considered as if you killed me and I'll be left with nothing. But then there's another reason why he cried. He foresaw, with divine inspiration, he foresaw in the future that Rochel will not be buried together with him, which is indeed what happened. Yaakov was buried in the cave in Hebron, Moras HaMachpelah. Rochel was buried in Beis Lechem. Leah ended up being buried with Yaakov, and since Yaakov saw that Rochel was his soulmate, it pained him that Rochel would not be buried with him and therefore be with him for eternity. Another interesting point that comes up in this story is when Yaakov asked for Rachel's hand in marriage, he knew Lavan. He realized that he was going to trick him, and therefore he gave to Rachel simanim, signs, like passwords, that she should tell him on the night of their wedding that he should make sure that it's the right girl that he's marrying. So what happened? Why didn't that work? Well, because Rochel saw what her father was doing, and she realized that Yaakov will ask Leah for those passwords, and she will not know, and she'll be embarrassed. And therefore, she was ready to give up not only her husband, but to be the mother, the matriarch of the Jewish nation, so that her sister wouldn't be embarrassed. Again, an unbelievable lesson from this story. But again, we need to understand the whole story here. We need to put this all into perspective. What exactly is going on over here? Why did Yaakov love Rochel? Why does the Torah describe Rochel as a beautiful girl and Leah not so much? What is the purpose of that information? What does that even tell me? Why is that even important? And what is going on over here that God made it that Rochel, that Leah should be ended up marrying Yaakov first, and only then afterwards Rochel. Now, what's important to understand before we go further is that every story in the Torah, and in Bereshis is full of stories, happens on two levels. Happens on a very physical, literal level. Every story that it says in the Chumash of Bereshis and Genesis happened literally the way it describes. But besides for that, this world is a parallel, is a reflection of what's going on in the spiritual world. And the real story, although obviously, yes, it did happen physically, but what the story is really reflecting is what's happening spiritually on high. And we find a fascinating thing that a lot of times we have very wicked characters in the Torah and in Tanakh, that in Kabbalah and Midrashim, it explains that these wicked characters actually represent great things like God or angels. For example, before we get to this story, Achashverosh, the wicked king Achashverosh, who was ready to annihilate the entire Jewish nation. The Medrash tells us that spiritually speaking, every time it says the word Achashverosh in the Megillah, besides for meaning the king Achashverosh, it actually refers to God. Because the word Achashverosh can mean Achris Vereshis, which means the beginning and the end, and God is the beginning of everything and the end of everything, and therefore the word Achashverosh can refer to God. Fascinating thing, such a lowly figure, but spiritually represents the highest things. And sometimes, actually, on the contrary, the higher something is, the lower it falls, but that's for a different discussion. And the same thing is over here in this story. Lavan was a wicked person, no doubt. But spiritually, his source on high, the word Lavan means white. White represents purity. Purity above represents the highest, deepest levels of godliness, the truth of God. That is what Lavan actually reflects. And therefore, what comes out, the story is that Yaakov wanted to marry Lavan, but the truth, godliness, God made it in such a way, Lavan, in the spiritual context, intercepted and stopped Yaakov from marrying Rochel first and made sure he married Leah first, and only after that Rochel. Why? Why was that God's plan? And why did Yaakov think otherwise? In Kabbalah, it explains, Rochel represents the world of speech, Leah represents the world of thought. What does that mean? What is the difference between speech and thought? Speech is external. Speech is for the other person. If I would be alone in the world, I would never need to speak. Thought is for the person themselves. In other words, speech represents going outward. Thought represents reflecting inward, looking inward. And that is the difference between Rochel and Leah. Both are the matriarchs of the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation has a mission. The mission of the Jewish nation is to be a light upon the nations, to show the world the truth of God, and to bring godliness into the world. That's Rochel. Rochel represents revelation, speech, revealing God to the outside world. Leah, however, says, yes, that indeed is our mission. But there needs to come something first. First, we need to look inward. First, we need to reflect, we need to think, we need to pray. We need to look within ourselves and improve ourselves and find what it means to be a Jew, and only then we can inspire the outside world. Rochel the Torah tells us, was beautiful on the outside. It doesn't, obviously it also means the physical features, but that's not what's important here. What it's trying to say is her beauty reflected on the outside. She represents reflecting Torah values, the beauty of Torah, the beauty of Judaism, the truth of God outwardly. Leah, it says, her eyes were red from crying. Why was it red from crying? So the sages tell us that she saw that she was destined to marry Esau, and she didn't want to marry the wicked Esau, so she cried and she prayed to God, and God answered her prayers. Prayer represents thought. Prayer represents introspection. Prayer represents looking inward. Leah was the master of prayer, and indeed, her prayer was answered. She married Yaakov, not Esau. This is what's going on over here. Yaakov comes to Haran with the intention to continue and to really start. As the third of our forefathers, Yaakov was going to be the one to bear the 12 tribes, to literally start the Jewish nation, bring them to Egypt where the entire Jewish nation started. He comes with the intention to marry, and he's looking for a partner. And he sees Rochel. And he wants to marry Rochel. Why? Because he sees the Jewish mission within Rochel. He sees, what are we all about? We're all about spreading that message, looking outwardly, spreading godliness in the world. But then he sees he's not going to be buried together with Rochel. So he cries. Why does he cry? Because he realizes that something is lacking. Yes, Rochel represents the Jewish mission in this world, but there's another component here. The very fact that he won't be buried together with her means that there's somebody else. Meaning, what does it mean there's somebody else? There's something else that's missing in the ingredients here to start the Jewish nation. What happens? He marries Leah. Lavan, again representing the white, the purity. God himself tells Yaakov, in order to be a Rochel, you need Leah. In order to spread the message outwardly, in order to be a Jew within the world and change the world and spread the message, you need to be Leah first. First marry Leah and then Rochel. As Lavan tells Yaakov, the custom in our place is not to give the younger one before the older one, meaning the older one represents what comes first. First, we need to look inward. We need to make sure that we know what it means to be a Jew. We need to make sure that we know what we have to give to the outside world. Otherwise, what are we giving them? What are we inspiring them? What light are we spreading if we haven't yet ignited our own soul? Now, these two things don't have to be very far apart. Yaakov married Rochel pretty much right after he married Leah. But we need to always remember the Leah just as it is so important to remember the Rochel. As I mentioned, just to get a little bit more personal here, I was just this past week in New York. And why did I go? I had a conference. I joined the international conference of shluchim, of emissaries, who are around the world, literally in every corner of the earth, spreading Judaism. And just to share, just for a brief moment, for one more minute, the inspiration that I took from there was in these two components, Rochel and Leah. And I think it's a lesson for everybody. Most of what I do is Rochel. Most of what I do is spreading out the message, spreading the inspiration to the outside world to try and teach the values of the Torah. And yes, of course, we learned and we had sessions and examined how can we do that better. But another key component, and what I came back deeply inspired about, was that in order to be a Rochel, we need to be a Leah. We also need to set aside time to think about ourselves, to work on our own service to God, to learn for oneself, to pray for oneself. Because in order to spread the light, we need to ignite our own soul. And that lesson is for everybody, not only for someone whose full-time job is being a rabbi, but every single person is a light to the people that they come in contact with, their families, their friends, their business partners, their acquaintances. And we need to always remember that yes, our mission is to spread the light outward, but don't ever forget about yourself. Don't ever forget about coming to shul and praying. Don't ever forget about setting aside time to learn Torah, igniting your soul, inspiring yourself, thought, Leah, and only then you can have the Rochel. You can look outwards and inspire the outside world and literally change the world, bringing God and the awareness of God in the world. Have a wonderful day.